You're listening to Quantum Harry the Podcast, a podcast version of the book Quantum Harry, A Unified Theory of the Potterverse by B.L. Purdom. Episode 8. Have you tried not being liminal? We begin this episode with a quote from Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, Chapter 37, The Lost Prophecy. "He chose the boy he thought most likely to be a danger to him," said Dumbledore. "And notice this, Harry. He chose not the pureblood, which according to his creed is the only kind of wizard worth being or knowing, but the half-blood, like himself. He saw himself in you before he had ever seen you." I've spent the last 6 episodes talking about 6 major archetypes that can be called either male or female, regardless of the gender of the character embodying the archetype. Each of these archetypes also aligns with youth, middle age, or old age, the stages of a complete life. The maiden, mother, crone, youth, father, and wise old man recur in tales from around the world. Other minor archetypes can also illuminate the Harry Potter books, but these 6 and the 7th one are the most prominent because one of these archetypes rules each of the 7 books in the series. The 7th major archetype could be called the hero, but that label doesn't adequately address the most crucial aspect of most heroes in myth and folklore, liminality. So I call the 7th archetype the liminal being, who is often a hero, but can also be an anti-hero, a doppelganger for a hero or an anti-hero, the hero's mentor, or the hero's love interest. The liminal being is the ruling archetype for the 7th book in the series, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. A character who's a liminal being is usually also another archetype, maiden, crone, wise old man, etc. A liminal being may be male, female, neither, or both, any age or no age. Of course, we've already seen in episodes 4, 5, and 6, when we looked at mothers, fathers, and crones, that a character may be any archetype regardless of the character's gender or age if the things that the character does align with the attributes of that archetype, which is why Hagrid is an archetypal mother, McGonagall is an archetypal father, and Snape is an archetypal crone. The liminal being having no intrinsic gender or age is part of the point. Liminality isn't about being constrained by limits on age or gender or by cultural norms. It's about transcendence. So, while liminal beings aren't always heroes, a hero, the word I use for heroes regardless of gender, is nearly always liminal. A hero isn't an archetype, but a story role, just as the villain is a role and the mentor is a role. Because of this, the villain or mentor can be a maiden, mother, crone, youth, father, or wise old man. Archetypes and story roles aren't precisely the same thing, though there's often a correspondence between archetypes and various story roles, such as the habit of mentors to be wise old men, or the way that crones often watch over a hero during childhood. An anti-hero or villain is also very often a liminal being, which makes the villain and the hero equals, even if they don't seem equal. A hero's other archetype, besides liminal being, can determine that hero's type, but there may be no link. Types of hero include action hero, folk hero, accidental hero, unlikely hero, tragic hero, and unwilling hero, to name just a few. TV Tropes lists over 130 hero tropes. However, catalogs of heroes and anti-heroes are largely lacking a description of the most prominent liminal being in the Harry Potter books, the metaphorical queer. The metaphorical queer has not traditionally been listed with hero tropes, but the liminal hero sometimes is. Since most heroes are by their nature liminal, this is a bit redundant and will overlap with nearly all heroes. A prominent attribute of many mythical heroes is being neither one thing nor another. Liminal beings have an ambiguous status. They defy classification. Demigods are a popular type of liminal being, and they're at the center of the Percy Jackson series by Rick Riordan, as well as featuring in a number of myths and folktales. This is for a good reason. As the child of both a mortal and a god, a demigod is of 2 worlds, the mundane, everyday, ordinary world, and a fabulous world peopled by powerful entities unlike the liminal being's ordinary parent. In science fiction, this often means having a human and alien background, such as Spock in Star Trek, Half human and half Vulcan, Spock is not completely at home with Vulcans or humans. Rowling's half-blood wizards also bridge the ordinary and the extraordinary. Liminality refers to a moment during a rite of passage when the one being initiated is neither in their original state nor in the post-ritual transformed state. During the moment of initiation, they're on the threshold. In 2012, Lynn Bosky Bernadette wrote in the New York Review of Science Fiction about liminal places and liminal states in Little Big by John Crowley. But what she says can be applied to a lot of stories featuring liminal characters. She wrote, in part, "One of the goals of ritual is to turn boundaries into thresholds, as when a shaman crosses the barrier between our world and the other world and then personally forms a bridge between them. Roads and paths can be liminal also. They lead from one place to another, joining them, but also help define, for instance, what is safe versus what is not, as in the story Little Red Riding Hood. Finally, liminality is also connected to the idea of hybrids, that is, places, people, events, and things that take part in two categories that are thought of as being not only separate, but dichotomous, such as the ghost or vampire. Some liminal beings don't have a dual background. They're all God, all alien, like Superman's Clark Kent and the Klingon Worf from Star Trek, or all wizard, like Harry Potter, who's only labeled a half-blood by Voldemort because he disregards Lily's Muggle background. Such a character bridges worlds if they grow up distanced from their extraordinary origins. The liminal being's dual background is often the excuse for the separation from the extraordinary, but without a dual background, a crisis like the Potter's murders, Clark Kent's home planet blowing up, or Worf's parents being killed by Romulans may force a character who doesn't start off as liminal out of their original home and into a situation where they're raised by characters we would recognize as ordinary humans. Crones have the vision to see across barriers, but liminal beings have a visa to cross them, a passport to lands ordinary humans cannot access. They intercede with the powers that be and return to the world with boons or the secret to removing a curse. Liminal beings are neither and both. They assimilate the major archetypes, and through bridging worlds, become greater than the sum of their parts. I first wrote about metaphorical queerness in Harry Potter for The Witching Hour, a symposium in Salem, Massachusetts in 2005, the second symposium organized by HPEF Incorporated, the 501c3 educational organization I served as a board member for about 10 years. After my Salem presentation, I was interviewed by Linda Rodriguez of Bay Windows, a Boston-area LGBTQ news outlet. 2 years later, she interviewed me for another Boston publication, the South End News, after J.K. Rowling outed Dumbledore. In my original paper, I said that I'd be very surprised if Rowling ever identified any of her characters as literally rather than metaphorically queer. And while I was glad to be wrong, it still didn't occur in the books themselves. So there are a lot of people who are still unaware that Dumbledore's gay, while other fans would be happier if she'd outed other characters popularly considered to be queer. The metaphorical queer can be considered a fish out of water, a recognized trope in literature. Gulliver of Gulliver's Travels is one example, and Bilbo Baggins is a more recent one. But metaphorical queers are usually in more dire situations than a fish out of water. They're often fish whose families are trying to fricassee them because of their differences, for which they're hated and punished. They're ordered to be quote-unquote normal, which is patently impossible. In response, the character often joins a chosen family of kindred spirits. We can see a parallel to this in the real world when sexual minorities choose new families if their birth families reject them. At least 2 other British authors writing for young people have used this archetype in other fantasy works before J.K. Rowling. Roald Dahl's 1988 novel Matilda is about a prodigious little girl, Matilda Wormwood, as different from her television-watching, status-conscious family as Harry is from the Dursleys, who bear an uncanny resemblance to the Wormwoods. Like Uncle Vernon, Mr. Wormwood does not appreciate Matilda's extraordinary abilities and would rather she behaved normally like her brother. By the end of the book, spoiler alert, Matilda has found a way to escape her birth family, with their blessing, and has chosen to form a new family with her teacher, Miss Honey, a kindred spirit who appreciates Matilda. In Diana Wynne Jones's Witch Week, WITCH, magic is something to keep secret about. in case government inquisitors find the witch in question and burn the offending person at the stake. When a young person fears that they may be a witch, the first reaction is an abject fear of discovery, which reads as very close to a queer youth's fear of anyone discovering that queerness. Here's a very telling quote from Chapter 4 of Witch Week. "He could not stop thinking about it. Could he do anything about it? Was it enough just not to do any magic? Could you go somewhere and be de-magicked, like clothes were dry cleaned? If not, and he was found out, was it any use running away?" It's pretty clear from this quote that, like orientation and gender identity, magic in Witch Week is an attribute that you have from birth. Here's another brief quote from later in Chapter 4 saying just that. "They couldn't help being born the way they were, and they didn't want to be killed for something they couldn't help." In Witch Week, one boy who realizes that he's magical is deathly afraid that he might do something to give himself away. In Chapter 5, Jones writes, "What terrified Charles was that he would seem to keep using witchcraft by accident, where it showed. If only he could stop himself doing that, then he still might have a chance. But how did you stop yourself working magic?" In the story, a teacher who finds out about Charles tries to protect him by trying to convince him in Chapter 8 to closet himself. "You're to forget about witchcraft, understand? Forget about magic. Try to be normal if you know what that means." We can see that the parallel between literally queer youth feeling pressure to remain closeted, to not slip and do anything that will reveal their true nature, and the analogous pressure on metaphorically queer characters to remain closeted is clear in both Matilda and Witch Week, just as it is in the Harry Potter books. Harry, a metaphorically queer liminal being, is resented by his family for attributes that are basic to his identity but not to them. The closest entry on the TV Tropes website to metaphorically queer characters is, "Have you tried not being a monster?" This often applies to vampires, werewolves, and half-demons, dangerous hybrids with abilities that may emerge without the express wishes of the so-called monster, potentially endangering others. Calling metaphorically queer liminal beings monsters doesn't take into account that the difference setting them apart from their birth families or foster families might not take the form of something even metaphorically monstrous, though Vernon Dursley and the Inquisitors of Witch Week might beg to differ. The trope is clearly a metaphorically queer archetype, and on TV Tropes it's described as what writers might do, quote, "when they're too cowardly to introduce actual gay characters, or when they feel that allegory or metaphor will be less likely to be censored," unquote. The second reason seems to be the explanation for J.K. Rowling's use of the metaphorical queer, which is highly effective and recurs frequently in the Harry Potter books. Roald Dahl and Diana Wynne Jones make good but less frequent use of it. Rowling is the chief modern reinterpreter of fairy tale and myth, retelling fairy tales, tropes, and motifs for a modern audience more successfully in terms of sheer numbers than any author in history, and she's now the chief modern author to extensively use the metaphorical queer archetype. The Great Hermaphrodite, or the GH, is related to the metaphorical queer. It's a concept from alchemy, the great work of making a philosopher's stone. The GH is not truly about a binary or neutral gender identity. It's a symbolic union of opposites, like the yin-yang. The Great Hermaphrodite, like the metaphorical queer and other liminal beings, is an axis mundi, a link between worlds, heaven and earth, male and female, fire and water, earth and air, life and death. It's even a way to refer to the philosopher's stone itself. Fittingly, the material used to make the philosopher's stone in alchemical lore can also be considered a combination of opposites. This aspect of the prime substance, as it's called, does not change during the transformation that produces the philosopher's stone. A description of this prime substance sounds precisely like the sort of things that Voldemort disregards. In Chapter 2 of The Tarot, History, Symbolism, and Divination, Robert M. Place writes, "The prime substance is often described as something that is very common and of unrecognized value, the stone rejected by the builder and trodden underfoot, yet more valuable than gold. In modern myth, the prime material is like the comic book hero, Superman, disguised as the mild-mannered Clark Kent." Or the prime material could be an 11-year-old boy with messy black hair, vivid green eyes, and a lightning bolt scar. Harry is positioned not only as the prime substance used to create a Philosopher's Stone, but as the stone itself, which, when Harry catches it from the Mirror of Erised, is yet another symbolic snitch. Harry was entangled with the snitch and positioned as a metaphorical snitch when he caught it in his mouth during his first Quidditch match, and then symbolically gave birth to it by spitting it out. His liminality is therefore a very basic, deeply ingrained part of his character, as well as Dumbledore's. Only a liminal being such as Dumbledore, both metaphorically and literally queer, could cross the barriers needed to create the Philosopher's Stone, and only Harry, his surrogate when Dumbledore is gone, as a metaphorical snitch and Philosopher's Stone himself, can ultimately succeed in protecting it from one who disregards things that are, quote, common and of unrecognized value, unquote, like children, toys, games, and fairy tales, bringing us back again to the unifying thread that runs throughout J.K. Rowling's 7-book series. Diana Wynne Jones, Roald Dahl, and others have created characters that, like J.K. Rowling's characters, can be described as the metaphorically queer subset of the liminal being archetype. George R.R. Martin has created the Seven, a religion in his Song of Ice and Fire, better known as Game of Thrones, that revolves around a seven-faced god aligning neatly with the 7 archetypes ruling each of the 7 Harry Potter books, even using the exact same names for 4 of the aspects of the god. Like the archetypes I've covered in the previous 6 episodes, 3 of the faces of Martin's 7-faced god are female and called the Maiden, Mother, and Crone, and 3 are male, the Warrior, the Father, and the Smith. Like the liminal being, the 7th aspect of the god, the Stranger, is neither male nor female. Martin seems to have been inspired by Greek and Roman mythology in his use of the Maiden, Mother, and Crone. These aspects of the god are called upon for the same things that maiden, mother, and crone goddesses were in ancient Greece and Rome. Martin's father aspect of the god also bears the same name as the father archetype. Of the male aspects of the god, the warrior and smith have different names than the archetypes we've been examining, but they have clear analogues. The smith is a creator god. And while actual smiths create a lot of things, one of the primary things smiths are shown creating in Martin's epic are weapons. The smith as an aspect of the 7-faced god doesn't seem to have a stage of life explicitly linked to its worship, but it's easy to see the parallel archetype in myth and folklore as the wise old man. In the Harry Potter series, some of the most prominent characters embodying this archetype also create things that can be seen as weapons. The wise old man Ollivander is a wand maker, and wands are surely the most prominent weapon in Harry Potter. Fred and George Weasley are young wise old men, and many of the products they sell at their Diagon Alley shop are also used as weapons. In fact, some of them are used as weapons by Death Eaters in the climactic battle of Half-Blood Prince. And surely the Hogwarts education that Dumbledore, the ultimate wise old man, makes available to all magical children is a potent weapon. Mr. Lovegood's printing press is even a weapon of sorts in the 5th and 7th books. As I talked about in episode 2, This Old Man, some characters in the Harry Potter books embody the Godfather subset of the wise old man archetype. Some of the same characters embody the Smith subset of the wise old man. In episode 2, I also included a quote from Joseph Campbell that even describes one of the jobs of the wise old man as giving a sword to the hero to save the day, a sword that can only be created by a smith. Now, if we view the warrior aspect of the 7-faced god as an archetype, it would most likely be as a subset of the youth archetype, since almost any warrior is unlikely to not be a youth, and many if not most of Rowling's youths are also warriors. George R.R. Martin's warrior aspect of the god is chiefly invoked to ask for courage in battle by characters who are literal warriors. There's no implication that this warrior aspect is paired with the maiden aspect of the god, as we can assume the aspects of the mother and father are a pair. In Harry Potter, it's usually possible to identify a character as an archetypal youth specifically because he's paired with a maiden. In Rowling's books, as opposed to Martin's, love trumps war. Though, as we'll see, love is often presented by Rowling as another type of war, a war for someone's heart. So her archetypal youths could be seen as lovers who are metaphorical warriors. That leaves the seventh aspect of Martin's seven-faced god, the stranger. Martin says that this aspect is invoked to deal with death and the unknown, and that the stranger has no gender. The liminal being could be seen as analogous to the stranger, since liminal characters are able to cross thresholds, including the threshold between life and death, and a liminal being does not have a particular age or gender. The stranger's name also implies a nomadic nature, which is often a quality of the metaphorically queer liminal being, both because those who do not adhere to literal gender norms often end up homeless or searching for a home, and because they cross barriers. They're not limiting themselves to traditional definitions of gender, gender identity, or sexual orientation, literal or figurative. Because there's so much ground to cover concerning the archetype of the liminal being, I've spread this information over 2 episodes. Rowling's array of liminal beings covers a wide range. Muggle-raised wizards, Harry Potter and Dean Thomas, the Gryffindor scion of a Slytherin family, Sirius Black, a werewolf refusing to be a monster, Remus Lupin, squibs born into wizarding families, Argus Filch and Arabella Figg, magical creatures who are the ideological other in their societies, the Centaur Firenze and the House Elf Dobby, Muggle-born witches and wizards, Lily, Hermione, Justin Finch Fletchley, and others, a supposed Death Eater working for the Order of the Phoenix, Severus Snape, and the only literally queer character J.K. Rowling has identified, Albus Dumbledore. They're all liminal because they access multiple realms. Each links worlds, crosses thresholds. We'll continue examining the liminal being, especially the metaphorically queer liminal being, in the next episode, including the character who best embodies the liminal being in the book ruled by this archetype, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. You've been listening to Quantum Harry the Podcast, a podcast version of the book Quantum Harry, A Unified Theory of the Potterverse by B.L. Purdom. All music heard on Quantum Harry is composed and performed by B.L. Purdom. Next time on Quantum Harry, Episode 9, we're Metaphorically Queer, in which I continue to examine the metaphorically queer liminal being, ruling archetype of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. I hope you'll join me.